Yeah, sure. So it was kind of late in the evening on 4 July when we first got a call. I think the first dispatch came in through one of our channels, through either a family member or family friend of Nolan's, who ultimately put our incident commander in touch with his mother, who at that point was in full on search mode. She at that point was very concerned that he was actually missing and was doing everything. They were doing everything they could to kind of retrace the steps, get his phone, get his keys, all that.
6:30 in the morning, Gulfport International Airport. A small plane lifts off the runway with two men on board. One of them is flying because he owns the plane and offered it for free. The other is Brian Trascher, Vice President of the United Cajun Navy. And for 2 hours, neither of them says much. They just fly. Low, slow circles over water that stretches out in every direction until it stops looking like water and starts looking like glass. They are looking for a 19-year-old boy who is not 19. He's 18, and by this point, he has been missing for almost 2 full days. Trascher has done this before. Floods, hurricanes, boats that never came back. He knows what 2 days in warm Gulf water usually means, and he knows what it doesn't mean. And he has learned not to say either one out loud until he has to. They fly from Horn Island down toward Ship Island, then further south toward Chandeleur, tracking a theory about currents that Trascher built in his own head from years of doing this. Then they turn back north, back toward Horn Island, back toward the northwest tip, where a lagoon sits in the center of the island like a blue eye, and that's when they see the boats. 2 of them, parked in tandem, right at the shoreline. Not fishing. Nobody fishes like that. It's a Monday morning, and something about the way those 2 boats are sitting on that beach makes Trasher's stomach drop before his brain even finishes the thought. They descend. 450 feet, then lower. Law enforcement. Trascher can tell from the markings before he can tell from anything else. And then, at the shoreline, something else. Something that from 400 feet looks like it shouldn't be there. A body, face down, at the edge of the sand, where the water meets the land, like it was left there by the tide itself. Trascher has said publicly, for the first time in real detail, what that moment looked like from where he was sitting. Not from a press release, not from a courtroom filing, from the seat of a donated plane, flying at 90 knots, looking down at something he hoped for. 2 days he would never have to see. This is the story of what Brian Trascher actually saw, what his organization actually did, and what he says, flatly, still doesn't add up. Even to the man who spent 2 days in the air and on the water looking for answers before anyone else was.
Yeah, sure. So it was kind of late in the evening on 4 July when we first got a call. I think the first dispatch came in through one of our channels, through either a family member or family friend of Nolan's, who ultimately put our incident commander in touch with his mother, who at that point was in full on search mode. She at that point was very concerned that he was actually missing and was doing everything. They were doing everything they could to kind of retrace the steps, get his phone, get his keys, all that. So really, it was the next morning when we were told that there was going to be another boat going out, possibly containing some of Nolan's family. I'm not sure what the details were of that. In the morning on 5 July, that would have been Sunday. And by late morning, we had gotten basically another call saying, hey, if you guys have any boats in the area and can go out there and canvass the island, would appreciate it. So I had 2 of my volunteers from the Mississippi chapter from Ocean Springs, actually, that put in like say midday on 5 July.
If you followed this case at all, you already know the headlines, the reward, the funeral, the grand jury talk. What you haven't heard in this kind of detail is the search itself, hour by hour from the man who was inside it. The United Cajun Navy isn't new to this kind of work, and that matters here. This is the same volunteer organization that spent days searching the Gulf after the Sea Corps power lift boat capsized off the Louisiana coast years earlier. The same organization that, just recently, was still working recovery efforts after catastrophic flash flooding tore through central Texas. Trascher himself has led search operations where the outcome was good, and search operations where it wasn't. He is not a stranger to standing in front of a camera and describing something painful in plain language, which is part of why what he's chosen to say publicly about Nolan's case, and just as importantly, what he's chosen not to say, carries a certain weight. Before we get into the timeline, it helps to picture the place itself, because almost nothing about this case makes sense without it. Horn Island isn't a beach with a parking lot and a lifeguard stand. It's a federally protected barrier island, roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi coast, reachable only by boat. No roads, no cell towers worth relying on. Just sand, scrub, wildlife, and water on every side. It's a popular local spot precisely because of that. Remote enough to feel like your own private stretch of coastline for an afternoon. Nolan had been there before. It wasn't some unfamiliar destination. It was a normal 4th of July trip to a place he and his friends already knew. Let's start where it actually started. Not with a body, with a phone call. The night of the 4th of July, a phone rings in Ocean Springs, Mississippi. Christine Wansley picks it up. On the other end is one of her son's friends, calling around 11 at night, saying words no parent wants to hear about a group trip that was supposed to end hours earlier. Nolan never made it home. Within hours, Christine is doing what she will keep doing for the next 2.5 weeks without stopping. She's calling around, retracing steps, trying to find her son's phone, his keys, anything that puts him somewhere specific instead of nowhere at all. That same night, word reaches Brian Trascher and the United Cajun Navy, not through an official channel, through Christine herself, reaching out directly, the way families increasingly do when they're not sure the wheels of an official search will turn fast enough on their own. Trascher has been honest about what happened next, and it's more complicated than a simple villain or hero version of events. He's said plainly that there wasn't much that could realistically be done that first night. When he went to sleep on the 4th, he didn't know whether Nolan had turned up somewhere or whether the situation had already resolved itself, the boring, ordinary way these things usually do. A missed ride, a dead phone, a kid crashing at a friend's place. It's the morning of the 5th when everything changes. That's when Trascher learns Nolan is still missing, still gone, overnight, with no explanation. And that's the moment he's described as the moment real concern set in.
They went out to Horn Island. They went on the island first, took a drone, looked around all over from an aerial view, and then they ran a grid between Horn Island and Ship Island with the boat. Both of these volunteers, one's a rescue specialist, one's actually a member of law enforcement, so they have a lot of experience. And they stayed at it for a few hours, and then weather started to deteriorate, so they came back in. That's when we knew we were done for the day. On 5 July, we made the decision that on 6 July, that if the weather permitted, we were going to put an aircraft up because we were getting further and further away from the last time Nolan was seen alive. So that's when we put that aircraft up. We were wheels up out of Gulfport International at about 06:30 on 6 July.
Not panic, but the specific focused seriousness of someone who has done search and rescue long enough to know exactly how quickly the odds shift once a full night has passed without contact. His organization moves to what he's called an all-hands response. By midday on the 5th, 2 volunteers are already in motion. One is a trained rescue specialist. The other works in law enforcement. Together, they take a boat out, running search patterns using a drone in the air and a grid pattern on the water, covering the stretch between Horn Island and Ship Island, the same stretch of federally protected barrier islands where Nolan and his friends had spent the 4th of July. It doesn't go smoothly. Weather rolls in by early afternoon, and conditions deteriorate enough that the team has no choice but to abort the search. A full day cut short by something as simple and as uncontrollable as wind and water. That night, Trascher and his team make a decision that will matter more than almost anything else in this entire timeline. A boat search alone isn't going to cut it. Every hour that passes, the search area effectively gets bigger, not smaller. Currents move, the last confirmed sighting gets further and further behind them, and a boat can only cover so much water so fast. So they go up instead. A volunteer pilot donates the use of his plane, wheels up out of Gulfport International at 6:30 the next morning, the 6th of July, with Trascher on board, beginning the flight that will end at that shoreline, at that body, less than 3 hours later. Before we get to what happened in the air, it's worth understanding what Trascher believes was happening in the water, because it directly shapes how he reads everything that came after. He's described the water that week as fairly calm on the surface, with weak wind but unusually strong currents underneath, and warm, upper 70s to low 80s. Based on how he reads wind and current patterns from years of doing exactly this kind of search, his working theory is that Nolan was likely carried north first, possibly caught in a rip current before the tide eventually shifted and pulled him back south, closer to shore. He's pointed to a separate case weeks earlier near Pascagoula, a shrimp boat worker who went overboard and wasn't found for roughly a week, eventually surfacing much farther south than anyone expected, as a comparison point for just how unpredictable Gulf currents can be. Not identical circumstances, not the same case, just a reminder that water doesn't move in straight lines, and neither do the people or things caught in it. This is Trascher's theory, his read of the currents, built from experience, not a laboratory finding and not an official conclusion from anyone with subpoena power. It's the kind of theory that explains a lot, if it's right, about why a body might surface relatively close to where someone was last seen, rather than miles and miles away. Now, back to the plane. 6:30 in the morning, the 6th of July. Trascher and the pilot fly a long track, Horn Island down to Ship Island, further south to Chandeleur, roughly 30 miles beyond both of those islands, before turning back north. They've been in the air for about 2 hours by the time they come back up toward the northwest tip of Horn Island. That's when they spot the boats near the lagoon at the island's center, and then the two boats parked in tandem right at the northwest point. Strange, Trascher has said, for a Monday morning. Nobody's fishing like that. It doesn't take him long, looking down from the plane, to understand that whatever this is, it isn't recreational. They descend to get a better look, first to around 450 or 500 feet, close enough to recognize law enforcement personnel on the ground, then another 100 feet lower, circling. And that's when Trascher sees it, what appeared to be a body lying face down at the shoreline, right where the sand meets the water. His read in the moment was simple and grim. It looked like the body had washed up onto the beach. A park ranger on Horn Island had called it in around 8:45 that morning, doing a routine patrol and finding what no routine patrol is supposed to find. Trascher and the pilot were already in the air by then, already flying a long grid north and south when the call went out, which means the timing of the discovery and the timing of their flight overlapped almost exactly. Here's where Trascher has been the most careful, the most precise in everything he's said publicly. He's stressed more than once that he was looking down from roughly 400 to 450 feet in the air, flying at around 90 knots. Not standing on the beach, not kneeling next to anything. A glimpse, his word for it, not an examination. From that vantage point, he says the description matched what had been circulated about Nolan. The swim trunks appeared to be a similar color to what had been reported missing. And even before he heard anything official from the sheriff's office, he said he had good reason to believe it was him. On the physical condition of the body, Trascher has picked his words carefully, and it's worth relaying exactly how he's framed it, rather than simplifying it into something cleaner than what he actually said. Normally, he's explained, a body that's been in the water will show signs of bloating. Searchers in his line of work often look for a body to surface around day 4, but water temperature plays a role, and so does body composition. Given how warm the water was that week, and given Nolan's build, Trascher says they knew it was possible a recovery could happen as early as day 2. And this was day 2. From his altitude, he's said the body did not appear disproportionate in the way a body typically does after an extended time in the water. He could not see the face. He could not get a clear look at the front of the body, which was resting against the sand. What he could see was the back of the legs, the back of the arms, from a plane moving too fast, too high, to call it anything more than exactly what he's called it, a glimpse. That distinction matters, and it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Everything Trascher has said about the physical state of the body is filtered through those specific conditions. Altitude, speed, angle, distance. It is not a substitute for an autopsy. It was never meant to be one. He's said as much himself. What it does do is offer the most detailed first-hand account from someone who was actually there of the moment this 2-day search ended, a moment that, until Trascher spoke publicly about it, had mostly existed as a single line in official statements. Body found, northwest shoreline. Time, roughly 8:45 in the morning. The body was later positively identified through dental records, confirming what Trascher had already suspected from the air. Now, here's the part of Trascher's account that matters more than almost anything else he's said, because it isn't about what he saw. It's about what nobody has been able to explain. When asked directly what he thinks hasn't gotten enough attention in this entire case, Trascher didn't talk about the reward or the funeral or any of the public pressure that's built up around this story since. He went straight to a specific unresolved stretch of time. There is, in his words, essentially no confirmed information about what happened after roughly 4:30 in the afternoon on the 4th of July, the last point Nolan was seen with the group, right up until the moment he was found, days later. Think about what that actually means. Investigators have, by Trascher's account, interviewed as many as 60 separate witnesses. His own organization alone received a substantial volume of photo and video evidence from people who were out on the water that day. And still, nothing confirmed, no account that fills that gap, no timeline that says, with confidence, here is where Nolan was at 5 o'clock or 6 or 7 that evening. Trascher has said it plainly. It's genuinely hard to understand how someone can be seen with a group around 4:30 in the afternoon and then simply never be seen by anyone again. Not a partial sighting, not a second-hand account from someone who thinks they saw him near the water. Nothing. And this, more than the reward, more than the funeral, more than any statement from any attorney, is why Trascher has said he understands exactly why Nolan's parents have pushed as hard as they have for independent answers. In his words, it's like a vanishing that doesn't make sense on its own terms. That gap is still open. As of everything reported so far, nobody, not investigators, not the family, not the dozens of friends who were on that island that day, has closed it. It's worth pausing here to separate two different things that are easy to blur together, because this case has already blurred them more than once. There is what Trascher witnessed directly. The flight, the boats on the beach, the body at the shoreline, his first-hand description of altitude, speed, and what he could and couldn't see. That's an eyewitness account from someone with real search and rescue experience, told in detail for the first time. Then there is what Trascher believes, based on that experience, but not based on direct proof. The rip current theory, his read on the body's condition relative to time in the water. Those are informed opinions from someone who has spent years doing exactly this kind of work, genuinely useful context, but not findings, not conclusions, not something either medical examiner has confirmed. Keeping those two categories separate matters, especially in a case that has already had unverified claims spread faster than confirmed ones. A photo from a pool party taken a week before Nolan ever set foot on Horn Island that briefly got treated online as evidence of something it had nothing to do with. A video misattributed to Nolan himself that actually belonged to one of his friends. This case has already shown, more than once, how quickly a detail can travel once it's detached from where it actually came from, and how hard it is to pull it back once it's already been shared thousands of times under someone's name. That pattern matters here specifically, because Trascher's account is exactly the kind of detail that could easily get stretched past what he actually said. He did not say Nolan wasn't in the water long. He said the body didn't appear disproportionate from 400 feet, and that the timing was consistent with a shorter time in the water given the warmth of the Gulf that week. He did not offer a cause of death. He did not offer a time of death. He offered an aerial description and a working theory about currents, both clearly labeled as his own read of the situation. Anything beyond that, attributed to him, isn't something he's actually said. So here is where things stand factually, as of the most recent reporting. Nolan Wells's cause and manner of death have not been released, not by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office, which conducted the official autopsy, and not by the independent medical examiner brought in at the request of attorney Ben Crump's team, whose autopsy was funded by former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick. Both results remain pending. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office has said there is no evidence so far indicating foul play, but has also been clear that the investigation is ongoing, which means that statement describes where things stand today, not necessarily where they'll stand once toxicology and tissue analysis are complete. Deaths recovered from open water after multiple days routinely take longer to process than a straightforward cause of death would. Toxicology screening, tissue analysis, sometimes specialized protocols specific to water recoveries. Add in the fact that this case now has 2 separate autopsies running on 2 separate timelines through 2 separate offices, and the length of the wait becomes easier to understand, even if it doesn't make it any easier for a family that's already waited more than 2 weeks for answers. There's also the question that's followed this case from nearly the beginning, and it deserves to be addressed directly rather than danced around. Nolan was one of a small number of Black attendees at a 4th of July gathering on Horn Island that was otherwise largely white. Photos of him with that group of friends surfaced early in this story and were treated by different audiences in completely different ways. Evidence of something sinister to some, an unremarkable group of friends to others. Reverend Al Sharpton, who has become closely involved in this case, has been notably careful in how he's framed this specific question publicly. He has not claimed race caused Nolan's death. What he said is that it can't be ruled out either way until the evidence is actually in, a position that's more measured than some of the loudest online reactions to this case in either direction. That distinction is worth preserving accurately because it's easy to flatten a careful, conditional statement into something more definitive than it actually was. What can be said with confidence is this: Nolan's death has become part of a much larger, decades-long national conversation about how the deaths of Black teenagers get investigated. A conversation this case was pulled into the moment those photos surfaced, regardless of what the eventual facts turn out to show. That broader pattern is real and well documented. Whether it applies specifically to what happened to Nolan is a separate question, one that depends entirely on evidence nobody outside the medical examiner's offices has seen yet. It's also worth noting that not everyone close to Nolan has described his environment the same way. A former Ocean Springs coach who worked with him for years has said publicly that in his time coaching the team, he never witnessed racial tension among the players, and that he considered the group a close-knit team, bound together by football and friendship, not divided by anything else. That account doesn't cancel out the broader national conversation this case has triggered. It also doesn't settle what happened on that specific island, on that specific afternoon, among a specific group of friends. Both things can exist at the same time: a team with no history of visible tension, and a single day that investigators still can't fully account for. Neither one explains the other. This is exactly the kind of case where it's tempting to reach for a single, clean explanation, because a clean explanation is easier to sit with than an open question. But nothing about the record so far supports reaching for one. Not yet. Not until the people with the actual evidence, toxicology, tissue analysis, phone records, sworn statements, finish doing the part of this that can't be rushed by public pressure, no matter how much of it there is. Now, the part of this story that's played out furthest from any actual investigation and closest to a national spotlight. 2.5 weeks after Nolan went missing, hundreds of people gathered at Center Point Church in Ocean Springs to say goodbye to him. Nolan's parents, Christine and Elmore Wansley, sat through a service that mixed grief with something closer to a public campaign, a pattern that had defined nearly every public appearance this family had made since the 4th of July. Christine spoke about her son in the language of a mother, not a plaintiff. She thanked God, in her words, for choosing her and Elmore to be Nolan's parents. For the 18 years she said they'd been blessed with him. She described a gentle, calming presence, someone whose company made others feel secure. She said the emptiness his absence left behind will never fully close, and she promised, through tears, that the family will keep fighting for him. Elmore spoke, too, about his son's football career, revealing a nickname he'd given him, Mr. Cool Hands, because, as he explained it, it always looked like Nolan was hauling in a touchdown catch. A small, ordinary detail from a father about a son who played the game. It landed as hard as anything said that day, precisely because it had nothing to do with the investigation at all. That version of Nolan, the football version, is worth spending a moment on, because it's the one piece of this entire story that has never been contested by anyone. He was a 2-time All-Region wide receiver at Ocean Springs High School, known as much for blocking for other players as for catching the ball himself. One of his former teammates, a linebacker who graduated more recently, has said publicly that Nolan was one of the first people he ever met playing varsity football, and that he welcomed younger players onto the team the way a true leader does, with open arms, no ego attached to it. His coaches, both in high school and at the junior college level where he went on to play, have described the same thing in almost identical language. Not just a talented athlete, someone who made the people around him want to be better, on the field and off it. None of that resolves a single open question in this investigation, but it's worth holding on to because it's the part of this story that isn't waiting on an autopsy to be true. Then Sharpton spoke, and it's here that the funeral stopped being only a funeral and became something closer to a public escalation of the entire case. He placed Nolan's death inside a much larger historical conversation, telling the church that this case touches some of the country's deepest, oldest fears, not only in Mississippi, but nationally. And then, addressing anonymous critics who had accused him and Crump of exploiting the family for attention, including, according to reporting, someone who sent Christine a defaced photo with $signs drawn around her. Sharpton did something concrete. He announced a reward of $50,000 from his own network for information leading to an arrest and conviction. Moments later, he told the church he'd received a text. Tyler Perry, who had already quietly paid for the entire funeral, was matching that $50,000, bringing the total to $100,000. It didn't stop there. In the days following the funeral, former NFL wide receiver Terrell Owens, who had attended the service and stood behind the family during the press conference afterward, added $25,000 of his own, bringing the combined total to $125,000. Filmmaker Spike Lee was also present at the funeral, lending his own presence to a room already full of national media attention. It's worth understanding what a reward like this actually does, because it's easy to treat a number this size as progress on its own, when its real function is more complicated than that. A 6-figure reward attached to a case this visible will almost certainly generate a wave of tips, and, just as certainly, a wave of noise alongside them. This case has already seen unrelated content spread as though it were evidence, more than once. A reward doesn't just incentivize someone who genuinely knows something to come forward. It also incentivizes people who think they know something. People who want badly enough to be right that they convince themselves of it, and occasionally, people willing to simply make something up. None of that makes the reward a bad idea. It's a legitimate, commonly used tool in cases where investigators believe someone in the community is holding back out of fear or loyalty. It simply means the reward itself isn't evidence of anything yet. It's an incentive. And whether it produces something real depends entirely on what comes in over the following days. and how carefully it gets checked before any of it reaches investigators with actual authority to act on it. There's a practical layer here too. Rewards like this one are typically administered through the organizations offering them, not directly by law enforcement, which means tips will likely need to pass through Crump's office and whatever process handles the celebrity pledges before reaching Jackson County authorities at all. That's an additional filter on top of a tip line that, by all accounts, was already handling a high volume of calls before this reward was ever announced. Sharpton, for what it's worth, addressed this head-on during the funeral itself, before he'd even finished announcing the reward. He said he wasn't there to make money. He was there to give it. It was a direct response to online accusations. Accusations he named specifically, that he and Crump were somehow profiting from this family's grief. Those accusations had reportedly gotten personal enough that Christine herself received a defaced photo, $signs drawn around her, sent by someone hiding behind anonymity. Whatever you make of the broader strategy at play here, it's worth understanding the reward announcement, at least in part, as a direct answer to that specific accusation, made publicly in front of a national audience, rather than quietly online. Still, none of that changes the basic mechanics of what a reward actually is. It's a lever, not a verdict. It widens the pool of people motivated to come forward, and it widens the pool of people motivated to guess. Sorting one from the other is now Jackson County's job, and it just got considerably harder. Attorney Ben Crump closed out the funeral with a message that's now familiar to anyone who has watched him represent a grieving family before. Boper, you beddens. Because this is far from the first time he's done exactly this. He told the church that until the truth is reached, until justice is reached, they will keep, in his words, ringing the justice bells for Nolan Wells, before leading the congregation in a chant, "Justice for Nolan Wells." It's worth naming, plainly and without cynicism, that this structure, a reward announcement, a call and response chant built around a name, a direct historical framing, is one Crump and Sharpton have used together at a number of prior funerals for Black victims whose deaths drew national attention. That's not a criticism of this specific family's grief, which is real and ongoing. It's simply useful context for understanding today as part of a larger, recognizable strategy for building public pressure around a stalled or slow-moving investigation. A strategy built on the idea that sustained visibility, not legal process alone, is sometimes what moves a case forward, particularly in communities with real, historically grounded reasons to distrust that the process alone will produce a fair outcome. Whether that strategy proves necessary in Nolan's case specifically depends entirely on what the evidence eventually shows. But it's important to read it accurately as a deliberate, practiced approach, not simply raw grief spilling out in public. 2.5 weeks. That's how long it's been since a phone rang in Ocean Springs and a mother started calling around for her son. In that time, this case has moved through nearly every phase a story like this can move through. A frantic search, a body on a shoreline, a wave of speculation online, some of it true, most of it not, national attorneys, national reverends, national athletes and filmmakers standing in a Mississippi church for a young man most of them never met while he was alive. And through all of it, one thing has stayed remarkably constant. The account of the man who was actually there, actually in the plane, actually looking down at that shoreline, has stayed almost exactly the same every time he's told it. No embellishment, no walking anything back. Just the same careful description of altitude, speed, and what could and couldn't be seen from 400 feet in the air. In a case that's already produced more noise than most, that kind of consistency is rare enough to notice. So where does all of this actually leave the case once the reward money and the eulogies are set aside? Almost exactly where it was before the funeral. Both autopsies remain pending. The cause and manner of Nolan's death have still not been released by anyone with the authority to determine them. The reward, the chant, the national attention, none of it added a single new confirmed fact about how Nolan actually died. What it added was pressure, visibility. a guarantee that this case won't quietly fade the way 3-week-old regional stories sometimes do once the cameras move on to something else. And underneath every bit of that public pressure sits the one detail that Brian Trascher, the man who was actually in the air over Horn Island, keeps coming back to. Not the reward, not the historical framing, not the chant, the gap. 4:30 in the afternoon on the 4th of July, to the moment a park ranger found a body on a shoreline 2 days later. A stretch of time that, according to the person who spent those 2 days searching for Nolan personally, still doesn't add up. No matter how many witnesses have been interviewed, no matter how much video and photo evidence has come in, somebody was on that island after 4:30. Somebody saw something. That's not speculation. That's the exact conclusion of the man whose plane was circling 400 feet over Nolan's body less than 3 hours after that gap finally ended. Whatever this case eventually turns out to be, a tragic accident with an unusually messy and painful set of circumstances, or something a grand jury eventually determines warrants criminal charges. That gap is still the thing nobody has closed. Not the reward, not the funeral, not 2 pending autopsies sitting on desks in 2 different offices, waiting. We'll keep following this case as both autopsy results actually come back, as investigators work through whatever tips come in from that reward, and as this story moves toward whatever comes next. We'll bring you what's actually confirmed, and we'll be honest with you about what still isn't. Some of what you heard today, specifically Brian Trascher's account of what he saw from the air, his theory about the currents, and his read on the body's condition, reflects one witness's personal recollection and professional experience. It is not an official finding, and it has not been confirmed by either medical examiner's office. Official cause and manner of death remain pending as of the most recent reporting. If you want to see where this case goes next, the moment those autopsy results actually land, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it.